Thank you everyone for joining for the session. After last week's very fruitful discussion, the first half of GI symptoms session, and hope everyone is safe. And yeah, so today we'll move on to two important topics, that is constipation and bowel obstruction. Of course, there are so many other gastrointestinal symptoms that we see in palliative care patients, but we have chose three most important ones. The nausea and vomiting we finished last week, and today we'll be talking about first about constipation and then bowel obstruction. I will share my screen. So this is one of the interesting picture when I looked for some images on constipation. So today we will be talking about what is constipation and why should we discuss constipation, because I'm not sure whether the symptom like constipation is given so much of importance in any other place. And what are the causes of constipation that we usually see in palliative care patients, and how do we assess it? So it's a very well-known symptom. What is constipation? It is a passage of a small volume of feces infrequently and with difficulty. So it is not just complete absence of bowel opening, but you can notice if it is very difficult, infrequent, or seemingly incomplete defecation. So when we talk about pain, we always talk about stress about one important thing, that is to believe the patient. But I must say, not officially, but what I believe is when it comes to constipation, you tend not to believe the patient, because sometimes they may hesitate to bring up the symptom. Sometimes they may feel it is not that important because I'm here to treat my pain or treat my cancer or any other illness. So I need not talk about constipation. And even if you ask about constipation, it is many people consider it as complete absence of bowel opening. So it is not that. If there is difficult defecation, incomplete defecation, we call it constipation, or we consider it as constipation. It is one of the most mismanaged symptoms. Either we don't ask about constipation, or even if we ask, as I said, they tend to overlook. They say, no, the first thing you will hear would be, especially in our OPDs, are that I'm not eating, or the caregiver will say, no, he's not eating or drinking. He's taking only sips of fluids or not even drinking anything. So how is he supposed to have a bowel opening? So they find the question quite surprising when you ask them, is he opening his bowel regularly? Either they will say yes, or they may say no, but he's not eating. So that is one of the most mismanaged symptom, and the common misconception, even among healthcare professionals, that I have seen very commonly, is that they relate it to diet, not eating, not drinking, so there is no fecal matter. So we can go back and read the constituents of fecal matter. Is it just the dietary particles are involved in fecal matter? How much of it has water content? So it is not just the diet. And it is very often that even sometimes the patients bring up that I think I have difficulty in bowel opening, but they are not given much importance. Ignoring the psychological factors. We know that once we travel or we stay somewhere else, it is very difficult to have a proper bowel opening for many of us because of the change of place and a different place. Or imagine a patient who is not having any control over the bowel opening, or he is paraplegic, for example. They don't have any control, and they feel that the embarrassment because someone else have to clean them up, or they may be in a diaper. So they feel it really hard to make others to clean themselves, clean their private areas. And lack of privacy is very commonly seen, especially in a ward. You can imagine so many patients will be lined up in the ward, and In medical colleges like ours, they won't be having any privacy. They may or may not get a screen to have a little bit of privacy. So that is one important thing, and including that, if they are bedridden and they are unable to sit and put enough pressure, it will be very difficult for them. So a lot of psychological factors are there which we tend not to discuss, because it's kind of overlooked symptom, I must say. And we don't think constipation is going to invite much troubles, but it has a lot of side effects, especially when patients with multiple comorbidities or multiple debilitating illness in our setting. Suboptimal use of laxatives. Sometimes we don't prescribe laxative. Sometimes even if we prescribe, we just use lesser dose. Or even if we give the right dose, patients think that anyway I'm not having problem anyway I'm not eating or drinking much, so what if I have lot of stool coming out? So they take less. Even if you write the right dose, they may take lesser dose. Sometimes the caregiver tell them that not to take the complete dose. What if you have loose stools? What if I'm not there to clean you up? So a lot of suboptimal use of laxatives, not just from our side but from both sides. Sometimes they come up with atypical presentation, and we don't track it back to the constipation fact. They may come up with dyspeptic symptoms. Sometimes they come up just with urinary infection or urinary retention. Sometimes they come up with delirium or overflow or spurious diarrhea. And I must say that the most common atypical symptom would be overflow diarrhea, which we very often misdiagnose as diarrhea, and we treat diarrhea. So this is one of the criteria. It is not used in a regular clinical setting, but if you are to document and see for a research purpose probably, or if you want to make a protocol, this would be helpful. The Rome criteria, you should satisfy at least 2 or more of the following. Either more than 25% of the time they have to strain, or a loss of sensation or obstruction during at least 25% of the time, hard lumpy stools, and fewer than 3 bowel movements per week. And I must say it is totally subjective, and you have to start asking from their bowel habits before the illness, how frequent they used to have a bowel opening before the illness, so at least we can have a comparison. And why should we worry so much about constipation? Because in advanced disease, we know that it can cause a lot of colicky, abdominal pain. Already they will have a lot of anorexia, and we will add on to that if we don't address constipation. Nausea and vomiting would be another thing that they may have to face, and urinary retention. Very, very commonly they come up with urinary retention, and we may suspect many things, and we usually tend to ignore the one simple question: how is your bowel? When did you last open your bowel? Anxiety as well as depression and confusion and delirium in elderly. Very commonly they come up with confused behavior, and we can track that back to altered bowel habits. Causes. We give a lot of drugs that can cause, or we know that will cause constipation. The primary drug that we use will be opioids, antidepressants, antipsychotics, and some of the anticholinergic drugs that we use we know that they are bound to cause constipation. Metabolic, many of our patients will have dehydration and hypercalcemia when they have a lot of bone metastasis, or hypokalemia and uremia. These are all the common factors or causes that we see in our patients. Sometimes they say urinary retention and constipation would be the first thing that they come up with when they have a malignant spinal cord compression or a nerve infiltration. Sometimes the local tumor which will compress the area can cause constipation, like pelvis tumors, or sometimes RT-induced fibrosis, or if there is any growth or any painful condition in the anorectal region, or it can be due to obstruction. And very often we can see depression associated with constipation, along with hopelessness, worthlessness, and lack of interest. If you ask about constipation, usually they have constipation as one of their symptoms. Diet, we know that they cannot take a lot of fluids and fibers very commonly, either due to non-ambulatory state or due to the treatment related issues, or maybe due to the disease related issues. They have low fluid and fiber intake. Sometimes they come up with comorbidities which can contribute. We know that diabetes and hypothyroidism can contribute to constipation. And we know that a lot of immobility or inactivity. Sometimes just don't think about cancer patients, but about a patient who has no other illness but advanced age. We know that immobility can bring up a lot of issues. They don't feel like having a bowel opening regularly. And very commonly, inability to obey the call. It is a very common problem that patients tell us, because there'll be only one caregiver at home, or she may be in the kitchen or she may be somewhere else, and when they want to have the bowel opening, they may be unable to get a caregiver or to sit or transfer them to the commode chair. So they find it very difficult to obey the call. So whenever they want to pass the stools, sometimes it will be difficult to coordinate with the caregiver. So that is another important thing that we come with. And when coming to palliative care patients, very specifically opioids, we know that around 97 patients with morphine can have constipation. And in palliative care patients, dehydration is another cause. Reduced mobility, hypercalcemia, especially when they have multiple bone mets. If they come up with severe pain, nausea, vomiting, and constipation, then we can think about hypercalcemia. Neurological deficits like spinal cord compression or sacral nerve infiltration. It's all present with constipation. And many other drugs that we commonly use, anticholinergics, and we use sometimes antacids. Antacids are not really very common, but anticholinergics are very commonly used drug. And in other settings, ondansetron will be the commonest used antiemetic, as we said last week, and it is one of the constipation inducing drug. And how do morphine cause constipation? You might have heard this in your opioid session, but just to go through it, it decreases the propulsive intestinal activity and it increases the non-propulsive activity. So there is additional time available because the bowel is not moving as active as it should be. So there is additional time available for water reabsorption. And because of the inhibition of secretomotor neurons, less fluid will enter the gut. And along with all this, it reduces the sensation of rectal distension. So they don't have the feeling that they have to go to the toilet. So fecal impaction can happen. So again, I said in the last week, when they come up with vomiting, you have to ask 100 questions. Like that, I think in constipation, you must ask more than that, because they, as I said, it is often a misdiagnosed symptom. You have to. So the usual question I ask would be, how is your bowel? So the usual answer will be, okay, it's okay. Or it is normal. So then you have to specifically ask, when was your last bowel opening? Very, very commonly, either it will be 3 or 4 days back. Then suddenly they may say, I'm not drinking, I'm not eating. I just take some juice, few sips of juice. So I'm not supposed to have a bowel opening. So they come up with a lot of explanations. Why don't they have bowel opening? And once you ask, when did the patient's bowel last move, the next question would be, so they may say, okay, today morning I had bowel opening. He goes to the toilet every day. He has bowel opening every day. Again, don't believe that. Ask again. What is the consistency, size, and volume? Don't get embarrassed to ask, because the patients will be really willing to talk about it, because they might be suffering. And the caregivers might be seeing the patient going to the toilet every now and then for bowel opening, and they think that, okay, the patient had a bowel opening. No, usually they struggle to have a proper, or they may come up with a incomplete bowel opening or not satisfactory bowel opening, and they just don't want to discuss about it. That is very commonly seen. So ask about the hardness, whether it is very hard, lumpy stools. Was there any mucus in the stool? Did you have to strain a lot during bowel opening, or do you feel satisfied after bowel opening? That's what I ask. the sensation of incomplete emptying. So I ask after bowel opening, did you feel that, okay, tummy is empty? So they may say, no, I felt that only little bit is going. Small heart, small stone-like lumpy stones like fecal matter is going out. Ask for any leak. For fecal incontinence, we are looking for. So ask them whether you soil your clothes frequently. They usually come up with the sentence that I have loose stools for last few days. So the moment you hear loose stools, you have to kind of 90% fix your mind that the patient might be having constipation. Okay, the moment you hear a loose stool, it should be the alarm for us. Ask when did it start, what is the quantity, what is the color, is it you feel that you have a leaking of stools, or you feel like a large quantity is going. When was your last proper bowel opening? So usually the overflow diarrhea will be the reason. And this is the Bristol stool chart. If you don't get the words to ask how to explain the fecal matter, then you can just show this picture and ask how is your fecal matter according to you. So it's one of the easiest picture that they can also understand and tell us. And while doing examination, check the oral cavity whether there is any dehydration, and for any GI symptoms and any intraoral symptoms, look for oral thrush, and do a physical examination of abdomen and listen for bowel sounds. If you're confused, I usually ask, explain to them why I'm asking so many questions, because I feel bowel opening is really important, and how diet is not completely related to the amount of fecal matter. Even if you don't eat or don't drink, there are so many other things that has to come out through your fecal matter. What if it doesn't come out? It just accumulates in your tummy and it becomes stony hard. Then you won't be able to push it out. And because you are so tired and you can't just push everything out, this will lead to nausea and vomiting and abdominal pain along with your other symptoms. So they understand. Then they tell us, yeah, you are true. I haven't had a proper bowel opening for a month or so. Then I would, sometimes people do deny that also. Then I ask permission for rectal examination. If they agree for that, and if you are really suspicious and you want to do an investigation, abdominal X-ray would be one of the investigation that we can do. Rectal examination, explain to them. None of us want to have an rectal examination, so likewise we don't want to give trouble to our patients also, but sometimes it is very, very necessary. And in palliative care, I think this is one of the most commonest things that we do almost every day, multiple times. So we have to explain to them that you are not going to do it painfully. Use a lot of lubricants, lot of lignocaine jelly, make them comfortable. Talk to them while you are doing, explain to them what you're going to do, how you're going to do, and before you insert your finger. So explain the procedure and make the patient prepared. Keep talking to them and make them relaxed. And these are the few things. I know this is very, very basic thing that I'm going to tell you, but just as a revision for many of us. If the rectum is empty and collapses, we know that when you put the finger, you feel the rectum around your finger, then it is a functioning bowel. If the rectum is empty and dilated, we know that if there is a lot of space around your finger, that means you have a high up fecal matter high up in the bowel. Balloony rectum, lot of space, then it indicates that there is a gross constipation. And if you feel feces in the rectum, you can determine the consistency. If it is very soft or very hard, do you need to evacuate it manually? If at all possible, just evacuate manually the first portion, whichever is possible. Then usually they will have ease in passing the other part of it. And when you do a rectal examination, you check whether you are touching a fecal matter or a tumor mass. So, and always look at the tip of your finger once you take it out, whether there is any blood or what is the color of fecal matter, what is the consistency of fecal matter. Everything you have to examine before you remove your gloves. Prevention is the key for management of constipation. The hand that charts morphine should chart the laxative. It is a crime if you don't write laxative along with morphine, because they will end up, definitely they are going to end up in a terrible constipation, and they will stop taking the medication even if they have very good pain relief, because they'll be very scared of the constipation. So the moment you write, make it a practice, the moment you write morphine, the next drug should be the laxative, the appropriate laxative, before going to any other adjuvants or anything. The moment you finish writing morphine, then you have to write the laxative. Non-pharmacological measures, every single day that you see the patient, you have to ask about constipation. I think I'll switch off my video because my internet is fluctuating. So every single day you have to ask about the bowel habits. So suppose a patient is admitted in a inpatient unit, or even if they are coming to your OP, or you're doing a phone call, very specifically ask about the bowel opening and record it, write bowel opening once in 2 days, once a day, without difficulty, not hard stools, whatever they are telling, you have to write it. If at all possible, improve the mobility, if possible, not for all patients. And another important thing in our setting would be access to toilet facility. You have everything, you have the laxatives, you have the caregiver to take care of the patient, but you don't have access to toilets. Very often they have only one toilet that will be outside the home, and the patient cannot be transported or shifted to that toilet. So they may use diaper, which patients may not be comfortable to have a bowel opening. A simple commode chair would usually very commonly fix the problem. We tell them to either to buy, or we provide them a plastic commode chair, so that there is privacy and they have the feeling that they are in the toilet. Also, not like passing fecal matter on a diaper. So access to toilet facility is one important thing. If possible, prompt response to patient's call, because they may want to delay it for the caregiver. So if possible, make it if possible, you can make it like regular timing or something if possible. Adequate privacy. We know that some of the homes that we visit will be crowded and the patient may not have a privacy. So tell the caregiver, and the caregiver will be telling you that patient is not opening his bowels. He doesn't want to do it on the bed, etc., etc. So it's about thinking about the patient as a person. He might have had a good dignified life, and suddenly he or she became bedridden, and now you're telling them to have the bowel opening when you are there, standing there. No one wants to do that, right? We need some privacy when you are having a bowel and bladder stuff. So that is one thing that we tend to ignore also. Why don't they have the bowel opening? Anyway, they are bedridden. So I'm standing there to support. You are standing there to support the patient, but the patient feels it quite annoying that people are standing around him and looking and telling him to have the bladder or bowel properly. So that is one thing that you can ensure. Talk to the caregiver, that importance of privacy. If possible, we can modify diet and fluid intake, but only for patients who are able to eat or drink properly. And give attention to other symptoms, like sometimes they may have associated symptoms like colicky abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, or confusion. So give attention to other symptoms also. And now we move on to the classification of laxatives. You don't need to by heart the classification. You need to understand why we are using this particular and when should we use, what should we use. We know that a lot of bulk forming laxatives. We know that fecal softeners. We have heard about osmotic laxatives, stimulant, and others. These are the primary classification that we teach in the classification of laxatives. We'll see each one of them. So bulk forming, the important role is to increase the fecal mass. So thereby it stimulates the peristalsis. The stool will be bulkier and softer. But we need to think that whether it is suitable for your patient population. We'll be having elderly or very debilitated patients, and for example, they are on morphine. So we know that the bowel is not, or the GI tract is not having a proper peristalsis. And along with that, if you give a bulk forming laxative, what will happen? You add on to the bulk, which will just get stuck there. They are unable to pass the stools. So check whether it is applicable to your patient population. It is usually unsuitable for elderly or debilitated patients because they need to drink extra fluids, and along with that, you are just adding on to the bulk. It is not normally used in palliative care patients. The next group is osmotic laxative, that is very commonly used laxative, which is lactulose. It is a non-absorbable sugar. It has an osmotic influence, which will cause a lot of water retention in the human. And it is said that it can actually cause dehydration and can cause cramping and nausea. It was not the primary laxative. I think in the latest palliative care formulary, they have mentioned lactulose as one of the primary laxative that can be used along with the stimulant, but it is not very commonly used in palliative care setting because it can cause some cramping. This is another group of laxative, which is just to soften the stool. That is liquid paraffin. It cannot be used alone as a laxative in our patient population because we know that it is not just the softening that we want. We need a stimulant also, so that the bowel, the fecal matter is passing and it is softer. So it is better to combine a stimulant and a softener. So bisacodyl is one of the most commonly used stimulant laxative for morphine-induced constipation. I usually ask them, the moment you prescribe morphine, we usually write the stimulant and the softener. The most commonly used or available softener would be crimafin, the plain crimafin, along with bisacodyl 10 mg night dose. So I tell them to combine both. And even after that, if they are telling you they are constipated, I ask whether it is difficulty to pass the stool or is it the hardness. So then you can decide whether to increase the stimulant or the softener. So this would be the prescription for laxative, bisacodyl, to start with 10 milligram at night time, either plus or minus softener. Some people do well with just with stimulant. They may not need a softener, but some people do need a softener. And you can gradually keep increasing up to 30 milligram a day. That is 10 milligram plus or minus softener. And rectal measures, either manual removal or suppositories or high or low enema. And in our place, we have made it a kind of protocol that all the patients should have bowel opening at least the third day. So third day is the max. 3 days is the maximum that you need to wait. Nothing more than that. Not even a single day more than that. So every third day, so every day during the rounds, we ask the bowel opening, we record. The moment it becomes the second day night till second day night and third day morning, morning when the nurses give the bed care and everything, if they have not opened the bowel, they give either they do a manual removal or suppositories or enema according to the rectal examination. So it is mandatory. And I tell the caregiver also, max to max, you can wait for 2 days. Third day, they should have the bowel opening. If not, keep a suppository. It's easier to teach them how to keep a suppository at home. So teach them and they do it at home. So third day is because anything more than third day, the stool becomes really hard and our patients cannot strain enough to push it out, or they feel it like painful defecation. So third day would be the best. Very importantly, very important is spurious or overflow diarrhea. Very misdiagnosed symptom. They come up with sudden onset of diarrhea, and we tend to give drugs for treating diarrhea, and they literally worsen the situation. So the moment you hear about diarrhea, especially in patients taking morphine, ask the last bowel opening. When was it? It will be weeks back or months back, and then they come up with diarrhea. So ask them whether it is like kind of leaking dark colored stools, frequent soiling of clothes, and how long they have not had a proper bowel opening. So this suggests chronic constipation and fecal impaction. Then we may need to have a proper rectal examination and digital evacuation, and then we may need to have a regularization of laxatives. So one thing I would like to, I forgot to add it to this slide this time. One thing would be that for fecal impaction or high fecal impaction, what we do is like we give high-up enema. So we just attach a suction catheter or a red rubber catheter or a Foley's catheter, whatever long tube, thin long tube you have, attach it to the bottom, the tip of the enema that we use. We usually use phosphate enema. So attach it to the enema and put a lot of lubricant, gently insert the suction catheter or the red rubber catheter, whatever tube we are using, completely inside till it moves without any obstruction. So gently pass it as much as possible so that you are actually passing somewhere near or above the impacted fecal matter. Then you administer enema, and usually they will have good bowel opening, because when they have higher fecal impaction, there is no point in giving enema, the normal enema, because you know that the tube length is really small. It is not going to help much. So it is important to give higher enema. Train your nurses to give higher enema. Any catheter you can use, either suction catheter or Nel cath, the one we use for intermittent catheterization, or you can use Foley's, or you can use a red rubber catheter, attach it to the enema sachet, and then administer 2 enema at a time. Pass as much as possible till there is no obstruction. So constipation is a symptom, not a disease. And if you don't give laxative, it is not going to work at all. It is very important to choose the appropriate appropriate laxative. And sometimes the Crimaphen and lactulose patients don't want to drink because they find the taste very, really offending. So you need to ask which is very feasible for the patient. Usually we need a combination of a softener and stimulant. That is the most common combination. And for example, if a patient, I sometimes tell people to use the suppositories. Especially it is easier for the caregiver, for a paraplegic patient or patient with spinal cord compression, became bedridden. It is easier for the caregiver to manage because it is kind of predictable. So every second or third day, I tell them to keep the suppositories before they give bath. So morning, if they're supposed to give bath at 10 or 11, I tell them to keep it at 8 o'clock so that the patient has good bowel opening. So the caregiver is there. The patient doesn't have to wait for someone to come and clean up, and the caregiver don't have to worry if they're going outside and they are just worried whether they are soaked in stools. Should I go back earlier? So it is very important that you plan the bowel regimen according to the patient and the caregiver's convenience and how easier it will be for them. So I tell them to use the suppositories whenever they have time. Might be in the evening, they might be going for work and they come back in the evening and they can keep a suppository and then they can clean up the patient very easily. So it's kind of predictable when the bowel opening is going to happen. It is good for the patient as well as the caregiver. So this is about constipation, and I will quickly go to bowel obstruction. And we'll take up the questions in the end. I'm not checking the chat right now, so we'll see in the end. So today we'll be bowel obstruction, so many contexts, but today we'll be dealing with signs and symptoms with the radiographic evidence obstructing the transit of GI contents. It can be either cancer and anti-cancer related treatment. So today, for the scope of discussion, we are including cancer and anti-cancer treatment related bowel obstruction. So there is a considerable variation in symptoms and approach to management. So it's like we learned about nausea and vomiting. You need to think, okay, this is the symptom. So what could be? Because we know that in a palliative care setting, we just don't jump and do a lot of investigations and find out. Most of our diagnosis depends purely on history and talking to the patient, sitting with the patient, examining the patient. So it is really important to spend time with the patient so that you can get a good diagnosis. It is very bad prognosticator, I must say, because once you have the bowel obstruction, then expected median survival is 1:3 months very commonly, and it is mostly seen in advanced stages. It can occur anywhere from esophagus to rectum and very commonly seen in small bowel. It is most commonly associated with gynecological cancers and followed by colon cancer. So what are the different types of obstruction? Mechanical or functional obstruction. Mechanical when you have really a compression of the tumor, or functional when you have a nerve related problem, which will be causing the obstruction. Partial or complete obstruction, it's self-explanatory. That's why I'm not just explaining each and every word. single site or multiple sites. It can be intraluminal within the lumen, or it can be infiltration of intestinal muscles causing intramural obstruction. And very commonly we see extrinsic obstruction, that is obstruction from outside. It can be due to treatment like adhesions from surgery, reactions to chemotherapy, sometimes torsions, internal hernia. So it can be due to cancer-related treatment also. Very rarely we see intestinal pseudo-obstruction because of the destruction of neurons. So all the symptoms will be there, but there won't be any tumor obstruction or tumor-related factor there, but it can be due to the destruction of neurons. It can be due to drugs. Many of the drugs that we use can cause paralytic ileus. Sometimes associated with diabetic neuropathy. We had a patient with uncontrolled diabetes admitted in our place years back, and she had all the signs of bowel obstruction, and we were wondering why, what is this happening? And it was tracked back that she had many neuropathic symptoms along with the bowel obstruction. So my internet is really fluctuating. Sorry. So we'll just see, this will be familiar to all, but I'll just go through it. So whenever there is an occlusion to the lumen, what happens? It will delay the propulsion of contents to pass distally. So imagine a tube with a block. So whenever there is a block, the bowel will try to overcome or pass the obstruction. It will try to, okay, I want to move, but there is an obstruction. The GIT will keep trying, moving and moving, and that will cause colicky pain. So at this stage, it can be reversible. Sometimes it can be overcome by the activity of bowel itself. It can correct on its own. But sometimes the bowel keeps contracting, even though the contents may or may not pass. So what happens? It will keep moving, keep contracting, but the contents are not moving. It may be still there. So what happens? The whole movements become uncoordinated. This uncoordinated movements can cause more distension. So whenever there is more distension, so everything is getting like a cycle. Whenever there is more distension of GIT, there will be more secretion. Again, more secretion will cause more distension. That will cause more secretion. It becomes a vicious cycle. So it is all a part of GIT to overcome this small obstruction. So what happens then when there is the bowel contents are not moving, right? It is still there in the GIT. The bowel is really trying hard to overcome the obstruction. So this accumulation of secretion can cause increase in bacterial flora. We know that a stream which is not moving, stagnant water, there is increase in bacteria. So whenever there is bacteria, this bacteria can produce gases. This gas will cause more distension and more pain. I'm sorry, this consequences I'll discuss later. The slide got changed. Okay. So there is more distension and more pain when there is a gas production by the bacteria. So this bacteria can also cause inflammatory response. There will be release of the prostaglandins and other inflammatory mediators, which will cause edema and hyperemia. So already you have a distended bowel. Along with that, you have bacteria, gas, which will produce distension. Again, the inflammatory response will cause bowel wall edema and more distension. And there will be venous obstruction. So you have two parts of bowel. One part you have an obstruction, the other part is the unobstructed part. Obstructed part, there is decrease in venous drainage because and it can cause hypoxia. So this venous drainage obstruction can cause redistribution of the whole blood flow. So there is redistribution of blood flow between the obstructed segment and the distal sites. And there will be alteration in the splanchnic blood flow. So this can lead to multi-organ failure. Multi-organ failure is very commonly seen in the last stage of bowel obstruction. So the initial stage, we saw the bowel was trying to overcome the obstruction by increase in motility, which will cause colicky pain. So it keeps trying, but the intestinal contents are still stagnant there, which will cause more distension and secretion like a cycle. When it is not moving at all, there will be bacteria coming in play, which will produce gas and inflammation, which will cause the bowel wall edema. So the bowel wall edema will cause ischemia, and there will be hypoxia to the distal segments. All of this can lead to multi-organ failure. So we'll see what are the metabolic and septic consequences. So we know that there is a hypovolemia. This hypovolemic state can cause functional renal failure because there is decrease in blood flow, decrease in renal blood flow. This can cause a renal failure. And we know that there is dehydration, which will cause oliguria and hemoconcentration. If suppose the obstruction is high level obstruction, that is the biliary, there will be stasis of the biliary, pancreatic and intestinal secretions, which will lead to what I have written as the second point, metabolic alkalosis, hypochloremia or hypokalemia, especially if there is a high level obstruction, because we know that there is a stasis of biliary, pancreatic and gastric secretions. There is ischemia, as I mentioned, and sepsis, which will cause acidosis. And we know that distension, any distension in the GI tract can elevate the diaphragm, which will cause decreased pulmonary ventilation. Very often patients tell us that I have breathlessness. When the abdomen is distended, I have severe breathlessness. And there will be passage of toxins and intestinal contents to the systemic and lymphatic circulation, which will cause sepsis at the last stages. So these are the metabolic and septic consequences of intestinal obstruction. So coming to the this is for our understanding, and now we come to the very important part, the management. How to understand where the obstruction is. You don't have the high-tech equipment. You can't do CT scans for all the patients coming to our setting, right? So this is a rule of thumb. Higher the obstruction, more the symptoms and less the signs. Lower the obstruction, there will be less symptoms and more signs. The signs and symptoms usually depends on the site of obstruction. So we know that in gastric outlet obstruction, you might sound it really silly, but I would like to share how I used to remember all these things. If some people can benefit out of it. So imagine a wash basin block at the right at the upper part of it, right at the outlet. So the moment you start washing your hands, you know that it is blocked, right? The moment you start washing your hands, the water is stuck. Then you can see the water coming up in the wash basin. So there is an early symptom, early and severe nausea and vomiting. There are a lot of undigested part, or you wash the hands, it's really fresh. You just washed it, right? So you can see what all things are coming up. So the same thing with the gastric outlet obstruction, early signs, early symptoms, severe nausea and vomiting. And when you ask the patient, I take something, I eat something, immediately within 5 minutes or few seconds later, I vomit same undigested particle. So that is a gastric outlet obstruction. Okay, then now come to the outlet of the wash basin tube. It is blocked somewhere very far from the real wash basin. You keep washing your hands maybe for a day or till night, you keep washing without any problem. At night, you will realize, okay, small secretions are coming up and it's foul smelling, not huge quantity, but a lot of noise from the hose. So it is more cramping with nausea and vomiting, and the nature of the secretion will also be different. This is how I remember this, and it's easier to understand when you see the nature of vomiters, the signs and symptoms. So in large bowel obstruction, the symptoms appear later because you can keep washing. There is no block. Block is somewhere distally. So it will take time to accumulate and then come out. So symptoms appear really later. You might have seen patients telling you that I had my breakfast, no vomiting, lunch, evening I had tea. The moment I took dinner, I started vomiting. So there must be something with the dinner. No, the obstruction would be really distally. So they can keep eating 1 or 2 days and then they come up with the symptoms. And there will be considerable paradoxical distension, and there can be diarrhea because of bacterial overgrowth. So it's same thing like the wash basin pipe, because if it tends, the block tends to be there for a long period of time, foul smell and bacterial growth will be there. So there, now we come to the symptoms, the most common symptoms that patients tell you. One thing would be pain. Two types of pain. So when you assess pain, ask definitely, There are two types of pain they come up with. One will be a continuous background pain. They say it's like a tummy ache in the background. It is there all the time. But in between, I have a crampiform pain, usually when I drink or eat something. So specifically ask what all types of pain they have, and they come up with nausea and vomiting. So we just discussed in large bowel obstruction, it is usually very foul smelling. Sometimes it is fecal matter vomiting, but in small bowel or gastric outlet obstruction, it will be usually biliary. Sometimes they say, I drink tea and the tea without any change, it is coming out. So ask the nature of vomiting, and then you will understand where would be the obstruction. Constipation, flatus and stool are totally absent in complete obstruction. Very, very important question when you are suspecting complete or partial bowel obstruction. Ask whether they are able to pass to, gas. So they are telling, no, I feel like passing gas, but not for a few days. I'm unable to pass gas. So you should suspect a complete obstruction there, and check for altered bowel sounds. So this is a table. You can compare the symptoms in proximal obstruction and distal obstruction. Very simplified one. So that we said there are two types of pain. One is a colic pain and one is a background continuous pain. And if it, so again, I'm going back to the wash basin. The symptoms would be early symptom. We know that because the outlet itself is obstructed. And the pain would be periumbilical area, and they say short intermittent cramps. In distal obstruction, we know that symptoms will be really late. It is they say, but kind of deep visceral pain. They may not be able to pinpoint or tell. The other pain they may say around the umbilicus. The other one they will be like vague kind of pain, and there will be long intervals between two cramps. Vomiting in proximal bowel obstruction, we can see large amount of vomitus, watery or bilious. Usually there won't be any foul odor. But when it comes to distal obstruction, we can see the amount will be really small, but they are in continuous distress. You can see there is a lot of distension associated with that, and whatever they are vomiting, usually there will be foul odor. Distension of the abdomen will be less or sometimes absent in proximal obstruction because it is right there at the opening. So there is no distension need to happen. But once it is the distal obstruction, we know that it is a long passage. Wherever there is accumulation, there will be more secretion and distension happening. Constipation, proximal, it may be present, but in distal obstruction, there will be long-standing, maybe days, weeks, constipation. It rarely is an emergency. It's important to have our understanding about obstruction, and every time when you see patients with the probable obstruction, it's very important to ask them all these symptoms about nausea, vomiting, constipation, abdominal pain. Even tell them that you might, if you have a good rapport with the patient, I usually prepare them. Call us immediately. Don't wait for any constipation. Don't wait for any nausea, persistent nausea and vomiting. So it rarely comes as an emergency. And the very important part in the management is understand the goals of care. Where exactly in the trajectory, disease trajectory, the patient is in, whether it is the diagnostic part, or is it just the first symptom that the patient is coming to you, at what stage of illness trajectory they are in. Understand what is the goal of care. If it is just palliative or you are aiming for complete cure of this condition. So that is the important thing in choosing the management, I must say. So abdominal radiographs, we all know, altered water gas levels. Plain X-ray abdomen is one thing that we rarely go for investigations, but even if we are going for investigation, then it would be X-ray erect abdomen. Sensitivity is not that great, but that is one investigation that you can see. We can see dilated bowel loops or multiple air fluid levels, and it is useful in understand whether it is constipation or pseudo constipation causing a signs of obstruction. So this is the thing. And CT scan, we know that it is the most useful investigation. But I would say in a palliative care setting, if they come up with all these symptoms, I would not, or they have never taken a CT scan to understand. But that that is exactly what I said. You should know what is the goal of care, where exactly in the illness trajectory the patient is in. Then you think, okay, what needs to be done? What is the goal of care? Is it symptom management? Is it making the patient comfortable? And you suspect that it can be distal or proximal obstruction. So CT scan is the investigation many a times, because it can understand where exactly, whether there is a benign or malignant true or pseudo obstruction, or it can tell you whether there is any lymphadenopathy, adhesions, everything they can tell. So coming to the management, all the GI symptom management starts with mouth care, examination, check for oral thrush, hydrate the patient, offer ice to suck. They find it very useful sometimes, because the oral cavity will feel moist and they feel fresh because they can't eat really. If the patient is dehydrated and not dying really, if you need just to hydrate, um, then subcutaneous infusions. If the patient is dehydrated, really dehydrated, then you can go for IV hydration. Subcutaneous fluids are to maintain the hydration and for long term. And choose which route you want to give, because the patient has an obstruction, we can't give the oral medications probably. So you need, as we said in the earlier session, subcutaneous, rectal, intravenous, whichever is feasible for the patient in what setting you are working. So coming to the symptom-wise management to reduce the pain, opioids are the drug of choice, but what route that you will need to decide, because the patient has vomiting and obstruction, so we need to think which route to be given. We very commonly use the subcutaneous route. Very rarely we use the transdermal patches if they have very stable pain. So it depends on the symptom. Steroid is the drug for bowel obstruction along with antispasmodic sometimes. Steroid anywhere between 8 to 16 milligrams subcutaneously. We do a 3-day trial and then we see whether it is effective. And when you stop, you take Periton stop. If you think that it is not working after 3 days, you can just stop it. There is no point in continuing giving. I don't know whether it has been mentioned in any other session, but dexamethasone is the preferred steroid in this. The primary purpose is to reduce the peritumor edema, and dexamethasone, because it has a longer duration of action. And the second important thing is it has less mineralocorticoid action, obviously, but the very important thing is that it is better to give it once daily dose, or if you want to give twice daily, that is fine, but not at night, because it can cause insomnia. So it's better to, and we know that the duration of action is really long, anywhere between 24 to 36 hours. Why do we want it 3 times? Very, very commonly, we see 3 prescriptions of dexamethasone 3 times daily, which pharmacologically doesn't make much sense. So it is good to, suppose I have to give 16 milligram, I would give morning dose of probably in the afternoon also, but not at night. So dexamethasone is the drug of choice in this situation. And now if it is a partial obstruction, then I need to stimulate the gut motility. So metoclopramide is a prokinetic drug. We saw last week, 30 to 120 milligram per day subcutaneously. We start with 10 milligram TDS. If not working, then we can give continuous infusion also. But we start with the intermittent dose initially and see whether the patient is responding. Beware of any increase in gut colic. Wait there and ask whether the patient is having increased abdominal colicky pain. So probably the patient might be having a complete obstruction. Stop if the pain is increasing, because it may be due to complete obstruction and we can end up in complication. So if you're suspecting a complete obstruction, patient is not passing gas, you cannot give metoclopramide because it is increasing the colicky pain, means it can be complete obstruction. So then your focus shifts from bypassing the obstruction. Now we know that you cannot bypass the obstruction, then you shift your focus to completely treating the symptoms. Hyoscine butyl bromide is a drug that we use, Buscopan, 40 to up to 240 milligram per day subcutaneously. Ranitidine infusions are also proven to be effective because of its anti-secretory effect. Another very commonly used drug is octreotide, not in our setting because obviously it is a expensive drug, and and I think that evidence saying equal efficacy with the combination of dexamethasone and metoclopramide than the octreotide. Yeah. So octreotide, we know that it decreases this acid secretion in intestinal motility and the bile flow. It is mainly used for high volume vomitus. It is better to give us continuous subcutaneous infusion, not as intermittent dose. So anywhere from 100 to 600. Some textbooks say 800. I have seen people using 1,200 microgram per day as continuous subcutaneous infusion. And that is really good for high volume vomitus. For nausea and vomiting, either you can use haloperidol, because we know that now metoclopramide you can't use because of complete obstruction. So I would prefer to use haloperidol or promethazine. So then we have a constipation to manage, gentle rectal measures, and you can use small dose of softener if there is no colic. And you need to check whether this is causing a lot of colic when you use stimulant. So see whether it is okay to the patient, and use gentle rectal measures. Coming to the surgical options, I'm sure that there can be a lot of people in this group who can talk about this, but this is from a pure palliative care perspective. There are a lot of surgical options, but the primary intention of palliative surgeries are improving the quality of life and symptoms. Like last week only we discussed, a lot of surgical options are there, but usually these are aimed to improve the quality of life or to improve the symptom. So what are the interventional management? Now we saw the medical management, that are the management that we usually practice. But when you come to an interventional management, you might have seen a lot of people practice NG tube insertion. NG tube insertion is a temporary, it should be a temporary measure. I have written it in green. It should be a temporary measure, and it is useful in usually in proximal obstruction. It is just to vent the gastrointestinal secretion. The problem is at the moment you put the NG tube, that the caregivers would want to feed the patient because there is a tube in place. So the purpose of the NG tube is to vent the gastrointestinal secretion so that the distension is reduced. So the patient don't vomit really. And I usually ask the patient, this is the option, you have accumulation there. You might probably benefit from aspirating all these contents. Would you want to give a try? And I try, and I went to the secretions, and the patient is feeling quite okay. There was one patient who was literally crying out of happiness that he got so much of relief after venting all the secretions. Then I might probably keep it there, but not for feeding. We had so this patient wanted to taste everything orally. So he used to eat and taste spoonfuls, and the moment he feels distension, he aspirate and take out all the secretions so that he is comfortable. So he lived like that for a few days, so that he was really happy that I could taste all these food and I didn't have much symptom because he could aspirate all the contents. So it clearly depends on after discussion with the patient and where exactly the obstruction is. Not everyone would benefit from NG tube. So these are the other interventional treatment. Venting gastrostomy, usually done in patients unresponsive to medical management. But there are a lot of contraindications, and we need to see, as I said, where exactly the patient is in his illness trajectory. Whether he has a very poor performance scale, not a good candidate for surgery, don't even talk about it. The moment you give options, then they would really want to try it, and it may not actually benefit. So, so you need to understand where exactly the patient is standing right at the moment. Stenting is one another option, but the failure rates are really high, and it is useful if it is a single site obstruction. And palliative RT, again for single site obstruction. So if you are suspecting that, ask your oncology colleague whether this would benefit. Discuss with the oncologist and then talk to the patient. TPN is one thing that we usually come across when we get consultations for bowel obstruction. The patients will come with the TPN, and is it really beneficial? Very, very strong evidence telling that it will not help the patient in at this stage of illness. It will not improve anorexia, cachexia, but should we give it? So suppose it is justified only in patients with minimal tumor burden, and suppose the patient is going to undergo a definitive surgery. He has bowel obstruction, a single site, good prognosis patient going to undergo surgery within a few days or a week. He's waiting for the surgery. Probably I may consider TPN for good performance scale, but it is used in good life expectancy. But in patients who are literally having an advanced stage of illness, where our focus is mainly symptom management, reducing the symptoms as much as possible, TPN is definitely a lot of evidence. If you go through the PubMed or whatever search engine that you use, lot of evidence against TPN at this stage of illness. So just think what is the goal of care and what stage the patient is in and where exactly the patient stands in the illness trajectory. To summarize, the patients with bowel obstruction require evaluation. As I keep mentioning throughout the presentation, understand where exactly in the disease trajectory, what is the goal of care, how aggressively should we go through these symptoms. Pain, nausea, and vomiting can be, I will not say easily, but it can be really well addressed by medications given parenterally, sublingually, or transdermally. It can be really well managed with medications, and patients and families can be made comfortable through the use of medication. So it need not go through all this aggressive management, because ultimately our aim is to improve the quality of life, not to go through a lot of procedures so that we can keep trying. Yeah, we should keep trying, but the aim would be to make the patient comfortable, not to cure this obstruction. So that I think took a little bit more time because we had two topics. I'll check the chat. I didn't check it in between. Is there any questions?
We have a couple of questions in chat, doctor, if you can reply for it.
So why you prefer subcutaneous route to dexamethasone and metoclopramide? First thing, the difficulty in access to IV route will be one thing, because patients might have gone through a lot of chemotherapy and they don't want multiple bricks. Second thing, it is very, very easy to manage at home setting also. And it's very easy to manage in a home care setting. You can educate the caregiver. We had a lot of patients. We still teach them how to give these medications subcutaneously in a home-based setting. So very comfortable for the patient, and you don't need to keep changing the line at least for it stay there for at least 7 days. So it's easily manageable, and these are the medications that can be given through subcutaneous route. And the absorption is not, really good in the subcutaneous route. Suppositories, we use the bisacodyl, the stimulant laxative that we use is bisacodyl, and suppositories, we use the bisacodyl suppositories. We tell them to keep 2 suppositories at a time. Teach them how to keep suppository. You tell them to keep it on the side of the bowel, not in the center, because sometimes they keep it in the center and it goes into the middle of the fecal matter. We know that the suppositories are acting at the side of the bowel wall. It causes irritation or stimulation. So you teach them how to keep it through the side of the rectum anus. So tell them, give them gloves, give them adequate lubricant, and teach them how to keep the suppository in a home-based setting. Because in the outpatient clinic, we run outpatient clinics in many places where there is no privacy and you can't even do all these procedures. There is no toilet. So it's good to teach the caregiver so that they can do it at home at their own pace. Dose of softener, we start with 15 ml of Crimafin is the one liquid paraffin preparation that we get. We start with 15 ml usually, and then we keep increasing to 3 times or 3 times. The maximum you can give is up to 60 ml, that is 20 ml 3 times. So when you give 15 ml, tell them at least 3 capfuls, because it's always syrups always is 5 ml, 1 capful. So tell them it is 15 ml, take 3 capfuls. Okay, so these were the questions. I'm not sure whether there is any session or on subcutaneous, but that is one route that is very good for maintaining hydration, especially when patients are nearing end of life or with obstruction, because the caregivers feel so distressed that they are not drinking or eating. And these are the preferred line they can manage at home. The hydration can be maintained. They won't be having distress because they are getting dehydrated. And the caregivers feel really good that they don't have to take the patient to a hospital setting just to hydrate or to give these medications. So it's really easy to manage also. And you don't want to overload the patient with a lot of fluids intravenously. The subcutaneous, the rate is really slow. So it's gradually gets absorbed, and so you don't have to worry about overhydrating. Phenolphthalein as laxative, so I have not used it. No idea, no experience with phenolphthalein. If anyone else in this group have any experience, you can share. So the idea would be, if it is morphine-induced constipation, if you want the bowel contents to move, if you want a propulsion, if you want to stimulate, give a stimulant. If it is hard stool, give a softener. So it's about asking the patient whether it is difficulty in passing it out or difficulty because it is too hard to pass. Or we can take the questions in between also.
If there are no questions, can we move on to our case presentation? We will have a discussion after that then. So today's case presentation will be by Dr. Anisha. It's over to you, doctor.
Okay. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, doctor, you are.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sridevi, for the beautiful presentation. She has covered it very clearly because this malignant bowel, in this case presentation, I am dealing mainly with the malignant bowel obstruction scenario. It is actually, I think, next slide. Okay. It is a case of a 68-year-old female who had history of serous cystic adenocarcinoma ovary, stage 4, with pectoral carcinomatosis. Because this situation is a very common type of epithelial malignant ovarian tumor, and she presented in a pectoral carcinoma because the tumor has infiltrated the entire peritoneum. She presented with malignant intestinal obstruction, and she had multiple comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, and CAD. This was she had a poor GC with performance status. Performance status is the, I think many of you will be aware, it is the terminology we use in onco practice to assess the health general condition of the patient. If it is 0, the patient is having a very good well-being, and if it is 5, it is dead, and it is 3 to 4, it is they are a disability in self-care bedridden patient. That is, she was a very poor performance status patient. She had features of intestinal obstruction like nausea, vomiting, abdominal distension, pain, and obstipation. She was, as I mentioned, as a case of CA ovary with pectoral carcinomatosis and multiple comorbidities. On palliative chemotherapy with paclitaxel and carboplatin, on post-chemo date, and that is 10 days after the chemotherapy, she presented to the casualty with features of intestinal obstruction. She had a history of constipation for 3 days, and also she was on opioids, morphine, and prophylactic Dalpolax, and many other supportive measures. General examination, relevant points. She was general condition poor, febrile, vital stable, performance status rate 4. Per abdomen, there was distension, ascites plus, bowel sounds were absent, and other systems were within normal limits. Then we did the extra abdomen, showed multiple air fluid levels, which showed obstruction, and we did a USG. It showed a subacute intestinal obstruction because there were no evidence of perforation, but due to gross ascites, we couldn't make out the exact level of obstruction. And the patient was admitted, routine blood examinations. She was kept on NPO, RT aspiration started, IV fluid support, steroids, PPI. Prokinetics was initially started because of the incomplete subacute obstruction. It was started. And then she had hypokalemia, so KCl infusion, proctoclysis enema, antibiotic support, and was started. And we discussed the case with them from the with the surgical oncologist, because she had a very advanced malignancy, that's stage 4. So considering the poor general condition and advanced disease, we plan to follow conservative management. And ascitic tapping was done. Almost 2 liters were drained. Since it was a poor prognostic situation, we explained clearly the details to the bystander. And since RT was not reducing, we went for a plain CT on day 3, which showed obstruction. Still plan to continue supportive care. And on day 5, she deteriorated, showed USG showed intraperitoneal gas, hollow visceral perforation has occurred. DNR was signed, and she succumbed to the disease on day 6. The psychosocial aspects, she was a 68-year-old widow living with her daughter and family. She was not fully aware of the disease status and outcome as per the daughter's request. She says that she has become a burden to her daughter as she has left the family and her kids to look after in the hospital. She had poor tolerance to chemo because we could give only a compromised dose, even which was divided in weekly regime. And she had side effects of alopecia, which was also very much producing a stigma to her. And she had financial worries, the social issues like feeling of abandonment, and she was not at all tolerating Rylstub also. Rylstub aspiration was very much difficult for her. And the medications, as I mentioned, she was on palliative chemotherapy with paclitaxel and carboplatin, on morphine and other supportive measures for malignant bowel obstruction. And the summary, it's a 68-year-old female with serous cystadenocarcinoma ovary, stage 4, with peritoneal carcinomatosis. She was on palliative chemotherapy, presented with malignant bowel obstruction leading to perforation. She succumbed to disease despite the best supportive measures. And the discussion points, the points I want to discuss, this malignant bowel obstruction is really a challenging clinical scenario because the decision making needs delicate balance between the pros and cons of the intervention. The management is based, as Sridevi ma'am has said, it is based on the level of obstruction, clinical stage of cancer, the overall prognosis, and the presence of ascites. Because if we must always think of the patient first, then the disease. That's the in palliative setting, that should be the first scenario in management. So every time, if the patient's life expectancy is expected to be weeks to months, it is better to follow a conservative management. And if the patient cannot tolerate a morbid surgery, it is always better to follow a conservative line of management. And also in the case of the life expectancy is weeks to days, whether the reason for any measures like NPO, RTO, whether it is necessity, it's also we have to think, because we always tend to manage it like an interstitial obstruction. But sometimes, even though we can't alter the life expectancy, let it be a bit lenient in that situation. It has to be thought, I think, in this, especially in this scenario. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Anisha. I think this matches well with today's topic also. This is what we have been discussing, how should we go about it and how challenging it is to manage malignant bowel obstruction, how far we should go for intervention, what all should come under that. And I think all these depends on what exactly the patient wants. And as you said, the life expectancy, do you really want to put in a tube through the nose and make the patient not drink or eat when they are in the last few days or hours of life, is really something that we need to sit and discuss. And it is very commonly seen also, keeping the patient in NPO the moment they have complete obstruction. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So I assume that this patient's symptoms was well managed, like with the morphine and the other medications, right?
Yeah,
The symptoms
the
were
symptomatic
controlled.
management was given, but I had a small this nagging pain regarding this NPO, and Arush was requesting me, but we couldn't when she went for perforation, suddenly she succumbed to the disease. But that period, because RTA was she was not at all tolerating. So I was discussing with my seniors and all. So he told me, in such situations you can be a bit liberal, because not being very much strict to the such measures. So I think in certain situations, if we discuss the situation properly with the bystander, and if they are also opting for the same, we can just even send the patient home, explaining the prognosis also. If the patient is in a very bad situation and they don't they don't need a hospital environment, I think it can also be, there is not much options we can do in situation. Yes, definitely symptomatic management should be done, but regarding this, like NPO and aspiration, such aggressive invasive measures.
Uh, I would like to hear from other participants also. What do they think about NPO and rights to aspiration, especially when they have all these symptoms of obstruction, and if they are nearing the end of life situation? Do we need to advocate for aspiration and NPO? What would you do?
No, ma'am, I think it's not necessary. We can just send the patient home and keep the patient comfortable. PO and NPO will cause more pain actually.
Definitely the rice tube is, I mean, that is not required, I think. That causes so much of discomfort to the patient and for the caregiver. So, but in case, I mean, what will you do? We cannot see them vomiting. So how will you take care of that? It's a very critical question. No? So how will you take care of that?
I think many scenario, some patient improve with conservative management. So I think we should try all these measures, but once the perforation or anything situation happens and the patient has a mortality of like 100%, I think whether to continue that measures. That's what I am saying, because we have signed DNR, and all whether it definitely, if the patient comes to with this situation, initially we should try all our measures to save her life. That's the first point. But once the mortality, like if it is increases and the situation we can't do much, whether we can continue with such method. That's what I'm saying. But initially, I think definitely many patients, like they will improve on this such measures. But once the situation is going beyond our hands, what is the next, whether we have to continue? That's what. And sometimes the patient don't want a life in the ICU, or it will be like that. That is the scenario happens. But many times it is not in our hands, because every time we tend to practice a defensive medicine. It usually happens. Hello.
Yes, Dr. Anyone else would want to comment on that? When should we stop? That's a really tricky question, right? When should we stop doing all these? Should we stop?
That is what we should know. How do we decide that? How do we
Anyone
decide
else
that?
to answer that question? How do we decide when to stop and what to stop?
In my experience, I think if the patient go for a perforation and our measures are not, we know that it is progressing, the disease is progressing, we have to discuss clearly with the bystander what to do next. Because if the patient go for a bowel perforation and we are not planning a surgical intervention, definitely, even if we go for a surgical intervention, there is 100% mortality. I have discussed with surgical oncologists, especially in a very advanced malignancy. So we have to discuss. We can discuss with the bystanders and take a decision. At least we should give them a choice. That's what I'm saying. Because we have to explain. Some bystanders used to say, I can't handle the situation, I can't see you. patient can be kept in ICU. Some bystanders used to say, but others say, let her die peacefully in home. We have experiences such that. So we should definitely, in such scenarios, let it not happen, but we should we should take opinion also from the bystanders. That's what in this situation, when I think back, I think it should have been also done on the NPU, and after all this should have been done.
Any others, either in the chat session before?
Sridevi, can I?
Yeah,
I was thinking,
Aditi, yeah, I was coming to you next. Thank you.
jumping in. Look, I think it is clinically often really difficult. I don't think there's, it's based on our best clinical judgment really as to whether to persist with, say, intravenous fluids and any sort of life-prolonging procedure. I mean, I think we know that the surgical outcome in a patient with widespread intra-abdominal disease or multiple levels of obstruction is really poor. So, the surgeons usually can guide us clearly on the surgical dimension. And then we know, fortunately, that we can manage bowel obstruction pretty well medically with the sort of maneuvers you were talking about, the pain relief, the anti-motility drugs, the managing of the nausea, vomiting. And sometimes the Ryle's tube is a really good palliative option, especially if, as you say, I think if it's high obstruction, it gives great relief. But that's a discussion with the patient as to whether they can tolerate it. Some people tolerate them, don't they, very well. You're not aspirating, just allow, or maybe aspirating once or twice a day, or allowing free drainage. But otherwise, that distended gastric viscera is really, really uncomfortable. So if we're clear about a goal of care for comfort, then I think everything can be considered and weighed up with the patient and the family. So whether it's subcutaneous fluids, or whether it's the Ryle's tube, or whether it's intermittent analgesia, or the syringe driver if that's available. But generally surgery is a really poor option in these patients. So we're looking at all those other conservative, I don't know, yeah, but I think it's a careful clinical, like you said, we don't have to panic and don't have to rush. We need to think about this and get the best information to make a good clinical judgment in the patients, with the patients and families' input. Anyway.
Thank you so much for your.
Does that make sense? Do you think in your setting?
Sorry.
Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Anisha, and your setting, as Dr. Odette was suggesting, does that make sense in your setting?
Yeah,
like our setting, yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It is actually I think it's a collaborative approach with the surgeon, the oncologist, and everyone, palliative physician. Everything should be considered. All these opinions.
Yeah, we're very clearly aiming for comfort care in this scenario.
So there is a question in the chat. When can we call constipation and obstipation as obstipation? I don't remember exactly how many days. It's like severe complete constipation is what I understand is obstipation. Is there any days to weeks that we consider for obstipation? I'm not sure. It's a complete constipation is what.
Yeah, if the patient is not even passing motion and flatus, it is obstipation. That is complete bowel obstruction. If it is passing flatus, it is not complete. It is like that.
But you don't tell actually how many days of, right?
No,
The
no,
duration we
that's
don't tell.
no days and all. Usually stays.
So coming back to Dr. Anisha's patient, as Audit was mentioning, we do get all sorts of patients, like sometimes they don't want the NG tube, they find it quite distressing and they don't even want to try at all. Sometimes they do really well till they die with NG tube in place. Some people are okay in having spoonfuls because they know that they are probably nearing end of life, and they want to taste something, and that is absolutely okay. And some people just don't want. I don't feel good when I take even a spoonful of water. So if possible, the easiest way when to stop, when to start would be talking to the patient. They give you really good idea how to move forward. As I mentioned in the presentation also, 2 weeks back, we had a patient, severe pain with complete bowel obstruction, proximal obstruction, and he was on continuous infusion of opioids, antiemetics, steroids, top steroids, everything was going, and he was in severe pain. And then I sat with him, like, how can we actually, so it's always about going back and thinking, where did it come from, what can be done. So then we talked, and then suddenly he told, I asked him once, because as it is a proximal obstruction, it's a large volume vomitus. So he asked, do you feel relieved after vomiting? And then he was telling me, yeah, I feel quite relieved once the vomitus come out, and then I'm okay for some time. Then I asked him, would you think it will be good if you just put something and keep continuously draining the fluid out? Do you think it is a good idea? I was literally asking him because I didn't have any clue whether it is going to help him. He was very cachexic, very weak, totally bedbound, but in severe pain. And with that severe pain, when he's crying, I didn't want to put an NG tube literally. I was worried whether it is going to benefit or not. So I asked him, like I asked for opinion, like, do you think it is a good idea if we try this? And then he told, I think it may work. Because if this is accumulating and I feel pain, if it comes out, I think it will help me. And we put a tube, and all the medications we could reduce the next day. And he was quite, we connected a Euro bag to the end because there was a lot of secretions coming out, and it kept coming out, and all the medications we could reduce the next day morning. And this may not work with another patient with maybe a distal obstruction, or patient who doesn't want an NG tube. No matter what happens, I don't want a tube in place. This may not work for everyone. So the easiest way would be ask the patient, do you think this will help? Should we try this? And if you feel that, okay, this is enough, it is not working, ask. I think there is not much secretions coming out, and it is doing any help to you. You think it can be removed? Is it the right time to remove? If it is not useful for you, they'll tell you if it is not useful, remove it. So we don't have to take difficult decisions. They will usually tell you how to go about with that. Even with the metoclopramide, should we stop the prokinetic drug? Ask them whether this drug was beneficial to you. Did it increase your pain, or you felt quite relieved? If they're telling, no, I think after this medication I have more pain, stop it. Go to the next medication, or an anticholinergic or antispasmodic. So I think it's easier that way, to not to put them in trouble, but to ask them. If they don't know about the cancer also, it is okay. We can tell them that there is a block in your food pipe, and we are giving medications to overcome that block. So things are getting blocked, whatever you are eating and drinking. So you want to try this, or you want to reduce the feeds. Why should you reduce the feeds? They might be hungry. So you can tell them that why you are telling to reduce the quantity, increase the frequency, so that it can pass. The wash basin example is universal. Every patient will understand that. If you take small fluids, a spoonful, it will pass down gently. It will not create any problem to your tummy. So they understand. Otherwise, you are just telling the caregiver, reduce the amount, increase the frequency, and the patient will feel really upset. I want to eat. Why the doctor is telling not to eat? NPO, they told NPO. Now I really want to eat, but the doctor told not to eat. So give them sense of what you are telling. I told not to eat because of this. But if you want to have spoonfuls, it's fine. Stop when you have any discomfort. So I think it's more like a customized management. Ask them what do they want, what makes them feel comfortable. When do they want to stop it? Do they want to stop it? It's easier when you ask them. So I think that takes a lot of headache from us.
Sridevi, you're illustrating that partnership with the patient that really underpins a successful management, you know, because as you say, we need their real-time feedback, don't we, on what we're doing. They are, you know, it's all, in some level, it's experimental, and for each patient, they as you say, it's very individualized, and also, as you say, the caregiver, you know, they are really a critical part of the team. I'm not fond of the term bystander very much, because it kind of diminishes the importance of the role of the caregiver. I know it's a term used in India, but it always, I'm always a little struck by that term, because they're not passive in any way, whereas a bystander has a sense of standing by passively, whereas we're enormously dependent on the carer as part of the team. But yeah, you're illustrating that engagement with the patient really beautifully in what you're saying.
Actually, my sir, who also is retired from us, he used to say, whenever you are in a helpless situation or a confusion, the patient can help you, because discuss our doubts with the patient, then they will tell a decision to us what to do. I think it's very important, and many times this part is lacking to give the patient a choice. Especially in such situations where there is a diagnostic, like a challenging clinical scenarios, we can properly, if we discuss a patient itself, it will be easy for us to continue with the management. I think that's what it was clearly the scenario, that the situation, I think.
And try to draw pictures and tell them what exactly is happening. Draw a tube, draw a swelling. You don't need to talk about their cancer at this advanced stage. If they don't want to talk about it, that is okay. But you can talk about it. Usually I try to talk about it earlier, the cancer part, then it is easier to manage. But if you are seeing the patient at the end stage and you don't have enough time, draw simple pictures and tell them. And yeah, as Dr. Anish was mentioning, when you're stuck, ask the patient. And whenever you are writing medication also, this particular medication is for this. We are trying to overcome this block. Let's see how it works for another 3 days. And if it's not working, tell me. So they clearly tells you that it worked for initial 2 days. Now it is not working. So it's very easier for us to understand also. They won't be, because they know what we are doing and we know what we are expecting. Yeah, so that partnership is really important. And any other questions or comments before we wind up today's session?
I think if there is any need, we should be treated by doctors like you. I would like to be treated by doctors like you and Dr. Odette and Anisha. You think so much about the patient. Actually, it's an eye-opener.
I'm truly honored, truly honored. Sometimes I just go there and ask them, do you think this would work? And my nurses tease me that, why are you asking the patient? Because we don't know what they're going through, right? And it's better to ask them which medications are helping them, so that you can focus on that in a better way. I think all thanks goes to Dr. Rajagopal, who just carves the good out of us. Thank you so much for your participation and the discussion. Thank you, Odette, for joining us once again. Thanks. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Sridevi, and everybody for letting me join in. All the best.
Thank you.
So there is a link in the feedback in the chat. You can give your feedback in the